Phantasy Star 2 and Dragon Quest 2 are both very good RPGs. Since I'm following these series mostly in chronological order, there's going to be a few instances like this where I have a Genesis or Super Nintendo game and it's being compared to an NES game. This is going to be a pretty big problem for the Dragon Quest series since it's got 4 entries on the NES and, well, none of the other series really have that. I won't be focusing on graphics as much as I did with the other games. This will primarily be about the gameplay and the story. I like both of the stories in these games, but one of them is just a little bit better than the other one. This is one of those cases where I clearly like one game over the other, mostly because of nostalgia, so I'm gonna try to put that aside. Neither one of these is a bad game, I just simply enjoy one over the other. And I had more fun with one of them than the other one did, and I have more memories with it, but I'll put all that aside as I go through these two games. So let's go through just the basic overview for both of them. Both games are continuing the story from the previous game. They take place sometime in the future as far as the series timelines are concerned. They aren't too different from each other, but it does feel like the Dragon Quest series as a whole was always one step behind what the Phantasy Star series was doing. Phantasy Star 2 is a pure science fiction story, as the developers dropped any reference to Greek mythology from the setting. It's a standard man turns their life over to a computer, and the computer decides to wipe out humanity. There is, of course, references to the first game, some of the enemies from the first game, and overall it's just a really well done video game. Dragon Quest II is a high fantasy story that does a good job of continuing the story from the first game. It expands on the Dragon Quest world, it adds more towns, kingdoms, and I enjoy the changes to the gameplay in this one. It is a more complete game than the first game in that series. The basics of these two games are very similar. They're both turn-based RPGs from the late 1980s, so they have the same or similar game mechanics. Let's go over some of the major differences between the two of them, and we'll kind of flesh out both of these games a little bit more. There are a few major differences between these two games. Aside from the obvious graphical differences and the way they tell their story and just the overall look of the games, there's also differences in the setting, gameplay, and the story overall. Phantasy Star 2 and Dragon Quest II have pretty different settings, to put it lightly. Phantasy Star 2 is a science fiction story where you're fighting against mutants and robots, you travel between different planets, you have to go into space, all that fun stuff that you would expect from a sci-fi adventure. Dragon Quest II is a high fantasy story where monsters and magic exist. There's more of a focus on magic in Dragon Quest II than there is in Phantasy Star 2, and the monsters don't really go into the realm of being robotic at all. One of the biggest differences I want to go through is the gameplay in these games, specifically the party system. That's kind of what I wanted to focus on the most. Aside from having different party sizes, Phantasy Star has 4 characters in the party, Dragon Quest II has 3 characters in its party. You also have a lot more playable characters in Phantasy Star 2 than you do in Dragon Quest II. You also don't really go on a quest for them like you do in Dragon Quest II. In Phantasy Star 2, you just kind of return to the main character's house, seemingly at random times, and then one of the new characters will show up and give you their motivations for why they want to join your party. And then you can change their name or rearrange your party or anything like that. It's a little weird, and yeah, it's cool that you get more playable characters, so you can kind of customize your party however you really want. It's just a little odd how you get them. Dragon Quest II has you go on a quest in order to find your other 2 party members, so yeah, there's that. The two games tell their stories in different ways. Phantasy Star 2, it plays out like an investigation where you're trying to find out what's happening so that you can stop it. Parts of the story are told through comic book cutscenes, which I really enjoy. I just love the way that they do that. Dragon Quest II that uses in-game graphics, which are fine for the NES, and they were fine for the time. It's just not the same as those comic book cutscenes. Dragon Quest II doesn't really deviate from its main story either. After you've found your party members, you know exactly what you need to do. Right off the bat, you are trying to get to the big bad guy and defeat him, and you're just collecting the different items that you're going to need in order to do that. It's perfectly fine for what it is for the time that the game was released. It's just a fairly simple and straightforward way of doing things. Phantasy Star 2 has a few more twists and turns in it, where all of a sudden you're a fugitive and the computer that controls everything is trying to kill you, and it sends robots to destroy everything. Then it tries to wipe out humanity, then you go into space in order to fight it. You find out that, Dark Force or Dark Falls is back, and then there's a little bit of a twist at the end, which is never really brought up again in the series, but it's still a pretty cool twist at the end. Both of these games do have similar plot points and also combat. The graphics are considerably different, and I'm not really going to go into it too much. Phantasy Star 2 does look significantly better just because of the hardware that it's on when you compare it to Dragon Quest II. Some NES games look very good and look as good as some of the Genesis/Mega Drive games, but that isn't the case with these two. Just to get this out of the way, I'll briefly go over the differences in art style and just how the game uses visuals to tell its story. Phantasy Star 2 is more of a serious-looking game. It uses comic book cutscenes in order to advance the plot, while Dragon Quest II is more cinematic than the previous game. It keeps a more cartoonish art style, which I do like. I do like the way that everything looks in Dragon Quest II. I just prefer the art style in Phantasy Star 2. I think the graphics, in many ways, reflect the plots of the games quite well, so that's pretty fun. Phantasy Star 2 and Dragon Quest II, they're both turn-based games, so their mechanics are going to be pretty much the same. You have a party of characters, you're going to be fighting bad guys. Each character has somewhat of a defined role, so there's not a whole lot of differences between that. The plot structure is also fairly similar, but Dragon Quest II is not as involved as Phantasy Star 2 is. So let's get into what I think Phantasy Star 2 does better than Dragon Quest 2. Phantasy Star 2 has a better story, better gameplay, and I just enjoy the setting more than Dragon Quest 2. While the graphics are better, I don't really think that's a fair point of comparison between these two games. Like the other comparisons I've done, it really comes down to just a personal preference, and I enjoyed Phantasy Star 2 more than Dragon Quest 2. The story is much better. I enjoy science fiction more than high fantasy, so that played a pretty big part in this. It also has more of a message behind it, which is something that's kind of lacking from the Dragon Quest series as a whole, at least early on. There are also more twists to the story, and it feels like a grander adventure due to the space travel that it's featured in many of these games. Having more playable characters makes the gameplay in Phantasy Star 2 just a little bit more fun for me. It adds to the game's strategy, and it lets you customize your party in ways that you just can't do with Dragon Quest 2. There's also more plot points that, concerns one of the characters in your party. That's something that's missing from Dragon Quest. You have a very specific plot point with one character that you get very early on, and I don't want to give it away because I don't want to do any spoilers in this. Phantasy Star 2 just does a better job of using its characters throughout the game, which makes the story better overall. Sega took advantage of the new console to make kind of a bigger and better game than it did before. In 1989, there weren't a lot of science fiction RPGs on the home console, and this one really showed off what the system could do. It does just about everything better than Dragon Quest II, but let's get into what I think Dragon Quest II does better than this game. I was kind of struggling to come up with something for this section that I can point to and say, this is what Dragon Quest II does better. The thing that I thought of right away was really a lot of the improvements over the previous game in the series, and for lack of anything better to say, I'll say that Dragon Quest II does a better job of continuing the story from the first game in the series. The main characters in Dragon Quest II, those are all the descendants of the main character from the previous game, which is a nice way to continue the story from that one. I like the way it continues its story more than Phantasy Star 2 because Phantasy Star 2 takes place over 1,000 years into the future. Everything is just dramatically changed. No one really remembers the protagonist from the first game, and the only reason that your main character remembers her, or even gets a memory of her, is because he's having dreams about her fighting the big bad guy from that game. In this one, everyone seems to know what happened in the first game, and everyone knows that you're the descendant of the legendary hero, so it just feels like there's more of a connection between these two games than there is with Phantasy Star 2 and the original Phantasy Star. That's just from me reading it. It's, again, just what I think happened when I was playing these. Aside from how the game continues the story, I can't really point to anything else that is done better than Phantasy Star 2. It feels more like a direct sequel than, a story set in the same world or universe. Both games tell their stories very well, but I particularly like how Dragon Quest II picks up right where things left off from the previous game. I think Phantasy Star 2 is the better game overall. It's just a more complete game with a better story and more enjoyable gameplay. At the end of the day, I had more fun with Phantasy Star 2 than I did with Dragon Quest II. The story is really what carries me through these RPGs, and I'm a bigger fan of science fiction than I am of just high fantasy. Mostly because of genre fatigue with high fantasy. I've played so many of those games and read so many of those books that I'm just kind of sick of that genre at the moment, and was more focused and ready for something in the science fiction era. Phantasy Star 2 delivers a really great story with several pretty fun twists. I also appreciate how Phantasy Star 2 continues the story from the first game, but it feels like it's just another story happening in that world. It's not necessarily a direct sequel, it's just something else that took place within that world at a different time. Even though I do think Dragon Quest II does a better job of continuing its story, I like the way Phantasy Star 2 does it as well. There are more characters, which means you have more options to customize your party. You also have to make a party of 4, which I prefer as opposed to the party of 3 in Dragon Quest II. The inventory system and the combat are also much better than Dragon Quest II's. I really love the graphics in Phantasy Star 2, mostly because of those comic book cutscenes. Those are always really going to get me excited, and they look great in Phantasy Star 2. This really is a fantastic game that's on par with the RPGs on the Super Nintendo, and it's much better than many of the RPGs on the NES. If I weren't following this series in order, I would not be comparing these two games to each other. I would have compared Phantasy Star 2 to either Final Fantasy IV or Final Fantasy VI. But I'm following the 3 big series, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and Phantasy Star, in order, so yeah, that's just the way this is going to shake out. So let's get into, unsurprisingly, which one I would rather play. Phantasy Star 2 is the game that I would rather play. I was just more interested in seeing how its story would be continued from the first game, and that was really about it. I do like the gameplay and the setting and the story more than Dragon Quest II, but I was really more interested in seeing how this story would continue. Science fiction RPGs were still a rarity on the home console at the time. These were some of the games that, I just really enjoyed going back to, and I wish I had played them when I was younger, or at least played them more when I was younger. Phantasy Star 2 has more in common with really Dragon Quest 3. The gameplay is more complex than Dragon Quest 2, and you have more characters to manage. I enjoy this because it just makes the story a little bit better, and you also get to customize your party how it best suits the way you want to play. It can also make the game a little bit more difficult if you take characters who are a little bit weaker than others. Those are really the big reasons that I would rather play Phantasy Star 2. I just had more fun with it when I went back and played it. It's nothing against Dragon Quest 2, it's just, I don't find it as enjoyable as Phantasy Star 2. It will be more interesting to see how this game stacks up with Dragon Quest 3, just because there are more similarities between this game and that game than there are with, Dragon Quest 2 and Phantasy Star 2. So, yeah, let's wrap this up and everybody can get on with their day. As I compare these games, I'm starting to notice things that I had previously overlooked. The Dragon Quest series seems to be following what the Phantasy Star series was doing. I'm not saying that this was intentional, but it kind of looks that way when you put these two series next to each other. The first Phantasy Star had more in common with Dragon Quest II, and Dragon Quest III has more in common with Phantasy Star 2. It'll be interesting to see how the third games in both series stack up to each other, seeing how Phantasy Star 3 is kind of odd in the series, and maybe that'll have more in common with Dragon Quest IV once we get to that. I knew things were going to get a little weird when these games moved on to the Sega Genesis, and I had to compare them with the NES games. Things will get a little bit easier as I move into like Super Nintendo RPGs and compare those to the Genesis RPGs, but for right now it's just kind of at this weird point where stuff is just going to be kind of awkward. It'll also be that way when I have to do Final Fantasy II at some point and start comparing that to other games, just because I think the only version of it I have is on the PS1, so that's going to be another instance where I throw graphics out the window. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.